Olivier.
Hello.
Hello. Hello. Good
And
afternoon. How are you?
I am all right, thank you. How are you? How's everyone?
I'm pretty good. Pretty good, I think.
Have you been
So
up since midnight? Was really the first question I had.
I went to bed at about half 2 this morning, had a few hours sleep, and then came back in again.
Good,
But
good.
certainly it's been a late few nights. So just for anyone who's joining the call just now, or picking up the recording later on in this weekend or perhaps afterwards. So we're here on Saturday afternoon UK time at the Hack From Home Hackathon against the spread and social effects of COVID-19. Here with us is Olivier Thereaux. Terence Eden was the man who just spoke from NHSX, but here is Olivier from the Open Data Institute, which is a core place of thinking about data and the impacts of data here in the United Kingdom. Olivier will be presenting us and talking to us about data ethics. Data ethics being a core part of the reason behind this hackathon, as we try and promote in response to COVID systems that still protect civil liberties and human rights, and data ethics, of course, being a core part of the values that drive the Hack Lab and the Ethical Tech Alliance as organizers of this conference, hackathon even. So without any further ado, Olivier, would you like to talk us through and introduce Data Ethics Canvas?
Happy to. I am doing the dance of sharing my screen. I believe you can now see my screen. Do holler
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. Do holler in the chat if there's any problem with it. But yeah, so thanks a lot for having me, and the usual caveat, and I know it's not a good idea to start with an apology, but the usual caveat is I am not an ethicist, but I have been working with an organization called the ODI for quite a few years. And at the ODI, we have a mission to work with government organizations to basically make data work for everyone. That's our tagline. And one of the big things that we've had to do, especially in the past few years, is help organizations deal with data in a way that is ethical. Otherwise, they can't build the right amounts of trust with the people that are either represented in the data that they're working with or affected by the decisions that are made from this data. And we've seen quite a lot of high profile examples of trust being broken in the handling of data. And not all of those are illegal. And I'll get back to the difference between ethical conduct and legal or legitimate conduct, because they're quite different. We've seen cases like Cambridge Analytica, which really got people to start questioning their trust in big tech companies and social media in particular. But we've seen quite a few other cases, like the case of Uber deciding to roll out automated pricing surge algorithms that would actually harm people in some cases of crises. And quite a lot generally of backlash against the automated decisions being built from training data that isn't necessarily well audited or well thought through. So whenever you've got bias in training data that results in systems that are used for automated or semi-automated decision making, you may end up with really problematic situations where the system itself is a black box and the data that's been used is biased against this or that community or this or that group, and that is not something that can be easily tracked back. So there's quite a lot of backlash against the use of data for automated decisions. I've got it here on the screen, a kind of a patchwork of issues around use of data, collection of data, and that leads us to this landscape, which is really quite important right now because of this rise of new technology like machine learning, which is being operationalized a lot more than they used to like 5 or 10 years ago. We've got more data. We've got a lot of policy towards automated decision making, and we've got also some new legislation. So in this context, we've got a general public for which the trust around data is actually relatively low, except for a few organizations. And I know that Terence was here just earlier talking about the work that NHSX is doing it, and you can see that, you know, NHS in particular, and in some cases governments are still relatively trusted. But you see the numbers here on the screen that come from a survey that polling that we did in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, and we've been repeating that polling, and it's still quite low. The levels of trust in ethical handling of data across industries is really, really low. So we need to make sure that everyone working with data really shows and demonstrates that they are trustworthy with the data. Otherwise, we will not get up from those really poor levels of trust in data usage and data collection. Which leads me to that notion of ethics. And this is typically a talk that goes for an hour. So I'm going to be really, really quick, but we'll have time for questions, and I'll stick around on Slack afterwards. But essentially, what we need to think of as ethics is it's that space in between morals, which is like the conduct of goodness, and the legality, which is what has been codified with some enforcement mechanism. The ethics, if you want to think of it, is essentially the codification of norms in society. What does society consider to be okay? It would be one way to look at it. And of course, ethics has been around for a long, long time in a number of professions. For instance, the medical professions has had codes of ethics and very enforceable codes of ethics. If you are not being ethical in some professions, you can be struck off from the register, and you cannot practice. And for us, at least for my profession, so I'm a technologist, and so the technology profession, we really are coming late to this, and we are coming to terms with the fact that that very old saying, you know, with great power comes great responsibility, and technology has a lot of power and has had a growing power, and we're realizing that with this great power comes the responsibility to act ethically and to consider ethics in everything we do. And that's why we've been at the ODI and many others considering how to basically bring in ethics into our conduct and our projects. I want to mention very, very briefly the reason why ethics is not quite the same thing as morals, without going into the questions of moral philosophy and whether morals is something that's universal. There's this exercise called the trolley problem that was invented in the 60s by a philosopher called Philippa Foot, and it's the idea that you've got a runaway tramway, trolley, train, whatever you want to call it. And the brakes are broken, and you have to decide whether you let the trolley go straight and kill 5 people, or you use this mechanism and kill 1 person. And there's plenty of alternatives to that. But what's really interesting is that from society to society, the norms, the accepted better outcome really are different, and therefore one thing to remember is that ethical conduct will be societally dependent. And so for us here who are trying to do something that is really worldwide, I mean this Hack From Home is worldwide, it's going to be tricky to find the right ethical approach because ethics is societal. So now for data ethics, there are basically 2 schools to look at data ethics. The first one essentially is to say that you need to have principles and you need to apply those principles. And there's been a multiplication of ethical principles, some quite good, some a little more prone to what is called as ethics washing. Essentially, you've got pious words that say we're going to do good, but they're really, really hard to apply. I encourage you to look at some of them. I like the Asilomar principles. They're quite good. But generally, the way I would put it is that yes, there's quite a lot of them, but especially in the case of a hack where you literally have to make decisions as to what you're going to be doing. having a panoply of AI principles and data ethics principles is not necessarily going to help you to take the right decision in practice today. So in addition to principles, I'm presenting to you something that we've been working on at the ODI, and there are alternatives I want to mention. If you don't like what I'm going to be presenting, that's completely okay. There are alternatives such as .everyone, for instance, has an excellent framework called consequence scanning, if I'm not mistaken. And so there's basically a number of them. And all those frameworks, like the data ethics canvas that I'm going to present in a minute, are basically a set of questions that help you understand who's going to be affected by the decisions that you're making, by the data that you're collecting, and how do you make sure that the effects on them are the ones that are ethically appropriate. And then how do you make sure that you engage with the right people so that you are able to manage and mitigate those ethical effects. I want to very briefly talk through an example that helps you understand that when we talk about ethical decisions around data, it's not as simple as, oh, well, of course, company X, I'm not going to name names, were evil, and therefore they collected personal data in ways that was just evil, and of course the outcomes was bad. It's really quite a lot more subtle than this. And the example of Pokemon Go is really quite interesting. Pokemon Go was released a few years back, and I'm presuming that most of you know what it is. It's a game that that is in alternate reality. Basically, it superimposes the game on the outside world, and it makes use of points of interest in the geography of our countries and cities. Basically, if you've got a monument, they would typically be a point of interest in the game, and therefore people will have a tendency to go towards that monument because you can do things with it. You can play the game by being close to those points of interest. What you may or may not know is that those points of interest were actually built from a number of data sets. Some of them are actually open data sets of monuments. In the US especially, there was a big data set, open data set used to it for it. But a large proportion of the points of interest were actually created and crowdsourced by players of an earlier game from the same company called Ingress. And what's interesting there is that Ingress was a game that was played largely by, let's say, white men, especially in the US. That was quite clearly the demographic that was playing this game. White middle-class men with smartphones were typically the players of that. When Pokemon Go was created, the gameplay and the marketing was such that the demographics of the game became much broader than that, and brought in people from completely different demographics. But the problem was that because that earlier demographic that had been contributing the points of interest was essentially white middle-class males, then the points of interest were actually much more prevalent in the areas that were more leaning towards male, where male of a certain income and white were. So this is the map of New York and the points of interest for Pokemon Go. And actually there was a study made on that showed that essentially players who were of non-white, non-male demographics were actually hindered in the game and couldn't win at the game as much because typically the places that were around them were not as heavily represented in the game. The Niantic, the company that made Pokemon Go, worked on that and fixed it. But it's interesting to see that a relatively benign bias in the data set of points of interest that came from Ingress, the previous game, into Pokemon Go meant that there was a discriminatory impact on the game. Now, mind you, Pokemon Go, and at least this particular bias in the data and the impact, nobody got hurt out of that. There were other cases with Pokemon Go that caused potential harm, not this one, and that's why I chose it, because the story doesn't end too badly. But that's, I think, a really good example of how decisions as to what data you collect and how you use this data can impact specific groups and specific peoples in ways that you may not think of as harmful, but there are harms. At least there is discrimination and bias in every decision we make about what data we use, how we use it, and who we use it for, and by exception, who we do not use it for. And in the case of the Hack From Home, we're going to have to make decisions as to the data that we use and how we use it and who we use it for. But that also means that we have a responsibility because we decide to use it for specific people, for specific use cases, and not for all the possibilities of use cases that are out there. So this is from the study around Pokemon Go. So very, very quickly, I think I'm roughly on time. I'm presenting to you the data ethics canvas. As I said, one of several tools. This one is one that the ODI has created over the past few years. You can see here at the back of the screen, the first iteration and the last iteration, the one with the bubbles, but the content of it has only been iterated very, very slightly. And it's a series, as I said, of 15 questions about how you're going to collect data, how you're going to use data, and so on and so forth. And there's basically 4 groups of questions in the canvas: the data, the impact, the engagement, and the process. Now, I am mindful that we're talking about applying this to a hack, and therefore I understand that possibly engagement and process are going to be really hard to apply here. But I really encourage you to keep those 4 facets in mind when you think about ethics in your project, because, and as we were saying in the introduction, it's really quite important that we keep ethics in mind, even when things are urgent, even when we're trying to do good very quickly. Making sure that we don't harm the efforts that we're all doing by basically making a mistake and harming, say, a population, but with our work, is quite important. So very, very quickly, on the data, the 4 questions that the canvas asks you to think about is: what do we know about the data that we're using? Are there specific obligations, so legal or otherwise, around this? What are the rights? We're talking about open data, which is great. Most of that, if that's what you're using, will be openly licensed and therefore available for you to use and share. But in some cases, you may be tempted to use data sets that are not openly licensed. Then in this case, your rights around this data are slightly more or much more restricted. On the impact, and that's the bit that I would make sure that you focus on the most. And that doesn't have to be extremely complicated. You don't have to spend your whole hack stroking your chin about the impact, but really thinking for 5 minutes with your team about those 4 questions will have a positive impact on your project. And they're basically, what are you trying to achieve? There is a tendency of especially us technologists, and sometimes in some cases designers as well, to go, well, we've got data, this is amazing, we can do something with it. And starting from the data is sometimes the wrong thing to do. Starting from a problem that you're trying to solve is the right thing to do. Now in this hack, we've got really good themes and really good problems, so that might not be a pitfall you have, but still a good question to ask. And the other 3 are really the meat of it, is thinking about the positive effects on people. So the data ethics canvas is not a party pooper. We're not just here to go, oh, so you're going to do something's wrong. It's really a way for you to think about, who is this going to affect positively, who is this going to affect negatively, and how do you minimize that negative impact while maximizing the positive impact. Maximizing positive impact, minimizing harm is the essence of a good ethical conduct. But quite importantly, and that's something that I would encourage you to do if you have a chance to do that, if you're affecting a group of people, or if you are using data from specific people, finding a way to communicate in that purpose and engaging with people, even if that means literally here on this chat, finding people who are holding this data and talking to them, rather than just assuming that you can do it because it's a hack and because you can do it quick and dirty, will have a positive impact in the long term. And finally, process. That might be something that goes beyond this hack if your project continues, but think about how you're going to be revising this thinking. Ethical practice is not a one-off, and in the same way, looking at this ethical data ethics canvas and the question that it asks, it's not a one-off, it's not something you're going to do once, it's something that ideally you're doing every time your context changes. So if you're changing from, say, a quick and dirty hack to an app that is getting funding to be developed further, then think again about, okay, is our scale changing? Are the people that are going to affect it by this work that we're doing changing, and so on and so forth? And how are you going to review this, and how are you going to communicate your process for that? If there's one thing that all the research that my team's been doing on trust and trustworthiness is that breaches of trust happen not necessarily when people do something wrong or when they're bad actors. They mostly happen when people fail to communicate that something has changed. Keep that in mind, because that's the one nugget that will help you and your hack and the work that you're doing today be more trustworthy and more impactful as a result. I don't know if I mentioned that, but I should have. Everything that I mentioned here is actually openly licensed. So if you go to the link that is here, the data ethics canvas, and quite a lot of material are all openly licensed. So you can take them, run with them. You can even change them if you think that something is wrong and that they're not really adapted to your purpose. For the sake of this this hack from home, I would recommend just use it to the extent that you have time and that you are comfortable with. And I'm going to leave you with actually the work of somebody else. I'm going to try and see if I can do that without breaking everything. There's a blog post on our website that's an interview with someone called Alex Dunn, and she talks about the compromise between being agile and being fast, with the need for ethics to be something that is fundamental, structural, and going across everything. And she says something really quite nice about the fact that, move fast and break things. That might be something you want to do with a tech stack, but that's not something you want to do with ethics. So I'm leaving you with her words. I think I am out of time, but I'm here for a little bit if we have time for Q&A, and I will jump on Slack afterwards.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was a really interesting talk. In particular, I was fascinated by that Pokemon Go example you had, and all the data points that have been built into it. It really sort of flags the idea, as we mentioned in one of the earlier talks, that a kind of a system that you build it's as much a cultural and sociological artifact as it is a technical one. These things, these concepts are always interlocking. Someone somewhere has always made a choice about what data to collect, and that's driven by some sort of imperative, even if it's the most apparently neutral data that there is. I remember reading something about that a while ago. It was talking about AR and applications like that. Imagine if you have a history AR. Well, even that, if you're showing people augmented reality about a particular time in a city, then you are still only telling the story of that particular time. The choice to talk about Victorian London rather than medieval London, that is still a choice. Yep. With some kind of potential ethical implications rolling on from that.
Absolutely.
There's loads and loads of questions I'd like to ask. We only had one question roll in during the talk. So what I'd suggest is if I ask you that, and then we close it, and then if everyone who wants to keep on going then joins Olivier in the Ask Me Anything channel on Slack.
Sure.
The question was, if I get it up, supposing we do actually want to deploy ethical tech in response to COVID-19, how does the societal variation in ethics you mentioned, I think that was possibly in reference to the trolley problem slide, conflict with the open and global collaboration that is required to fight the virus?
So, and as with, and if there are any UX practitioners on the Zoom, you might chuckle at that. As with everything with ethics, the answer is it depends. But I don't know if you've seen it. There was a polling recently that was shared on social media that I saw yesterday that showed the response to the question: would if, because in this situation with COVID-19, there's going to have to be some triage about who lives and who dies whenever the health system gets overloaded. And the question was essentially, should we prioritize young people or old people? And there was a really, really staunch difference between places like France, where the response from the public polled was very much in favor of young people, and places like China and Taiwan, where the response was, no, you should prioritize older people. And that is a societal difference. That is a cultural difference that needs to be taken into account. Now, in this case, I think my answer would be in two parts. One is the first thing that you need to do is to be aware of that, to be aware that there is no universal that there's really no universality, especially in the nuance of ethics, and that awareness in what you're building, that humility in the fact that you may not have everything right is the key. You may then think about how the cultural differences and the ethical choices might end up being something that you have in your localization of the application. But again, we're talking about something that you're going to be doing very quickly. So my advice would be aware that there are differences culturally, and be aware that some of what you're going to be proposing might not fly in some cultures or in some ethical codes, and that's okay.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that. I think it's really interesting when we see what things structure ethics and the choices people have. It's one of the reasons why with the personal data account architecture that we are highlighting people through this hackathon, we think it has so much to offer. Because if applications build using personal data accounts, then ultimately they're not holding that data, so they're not tempted to use it or misuse it. The data gets to be owned just by the individual and held just by the individual. We think that's very powerful for a whole range of ethical applications and for instance, user ID systems that could come out of that. Now, we actually have our next call beginning in 2 minutes. So what I'd suggest is there's been a whole range of really interesting points raised. If you guys would like to pop into the Ask Me Anything channel for Olivier, that would be most welcome, and he'll be around for a while. Thank you so much for coming and addressing us. It's been a pleasure to have you here on a Saturday afternoon at the Hack From Home against COVID-19 hackathon. Really trips off the tongue. I should reduce the number of hacks. But yeah, thanks so much, and I look forward to chatting soon.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye.